Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this press conference. My name is Claire Shine. I'm the Director and CEO of CISL, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and we partner with business and governments and individuals around the world to develop leadership and solutions for a sustainable economy. So we're completing the first week of COP15, and today we want to discuss together with you how the CBD can spark wider ambition for nature that acknowledges fully and goes beyond protection of depleted natural resources, and to call for a focus on fundamental change in the way that business and finance operate to support and regenerate nature. So very briefly, how will this press conference work? I'm going to give a little bit of global context on the topic. I'm then going to pass to Craig Bennett, who is the Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust in the UK, who will talk about the 30 by 30 pledge, the climate and nature crises, and the urgent need for political attention. We'll then go to Tony Juniper, the Chair of Natural England, who will talk about the value of nature to the economy. And finally, to my colleague Elliot Whittington, the Director of Policy at CISL, who will talk about how business and finance need to change their approach to nature. We'd be delighted to take some questions at the end. We know we have the tyranny of the schedule, but we're hoping that we can either take questions from the floor or just after the meeting on a one-to-one basis. So some remarks from me first, the big picture around COP15. You know, we're surrounded by the data here in this conference venue of the catastrophic risks we face with the current rates of nature loss and damage. That doesn't just hurt our living systems, the life support of our planet. It has exponential impacts on people, on livelihoods, on the viability of business, and the viability long-term of whole economies. It has exponential impacts and consequences for peace, stability, and cohesion, whether within countries or across the world. So the time is now at COP15 to use this pivotal moment to put nature center stage, backed by high-level leadership. And for that, of course, we need a strong and bold global biodiversity framework to set the course. So we're keen that week 2 shows stronger ambition, marked progress, and really bold outcomes at the end. Just 3 points from my side. It's time to stop nature being the poor relation in this conversation. We need a common action agenda between climate and nature because both are needed for viable economies. Healthy nature and healthy climate are mutually reinforcing. Fix nature, and we go a long way to fixing climate. The solutions are mutually reinforcing. And yet, most governments, most business, and most financial institutions still treat them in separate buckets. And as many of you will have observed, the level and visibility of high-level political leadership here this week for nature is very different from what you will have seen at COP27 for climate in Egypt. So true future-focused leadership for nature must include finance, business, and senior political decision makers. Point number 2, let's think about voice. Who is at the table? Those who most visibly speak up for nature and its life support systems don't span the full range of those who should and can step up to push for change. In Canada, for those of you from this wonderful country, and around the world, it's critical to make more visible the voices from Indigenous peoples, people whose livelihoods are deeply rooted in our life support systems, and local communities, the people who have the emotional bond, the traditional knowledge and rights, and who are most often on the very front line of the depletion and destruction of nature. And I should add, the people who, as climate impacts mount, will be the first to be forced away from their land. And that is too little talked about. So third, to get faster movement with the Convention on Biodiversity, we need to push nature into being understood by all of us as a mainstream economic issue, indeed the bedrock of future economy. All livelihoods, all economic activity, and all forms of human well-being depend in different ways on nature thriving, because there is no business long-term on a broken planet, and there is certainly no business long-term in a broken society. Business as usual right now is costing us. It's costing business directly and in terms of the lost opportunities for innovation. It's costing governments. It's costing people's health. We take nature for granted, and continuing to do so, treating it as a free good, is one of the craziest errors that we could possibly commit as humanity. So we also know that with the recent pandemic, and COVID was not the only pandemic, and it won't be the last pandemic, that disrupting and damaging and losing the stability of healthy natural systems has tipping points and consequences that too often we don't understand or track or anticipate. The cost of what we have paid as families, as nations, and as a global economy for that pandemic is incalculable. Thinking about where nature-based solutions and the regeneration of healthy life support systems on sea and at land, what that could mean, it also relates directly into the pandemic and conflict risks. So fourth, these changes are not pie in the sky. We're not talking about utopia here. The attitudes, the expectations, and the demands of people of all generations, but perhaps particularly younger generations, are changing fast. And enlightened corporate and business leaders know that. They see the rising demand within their organizations for a new way of working, a new way of being together, and a new way of putting values, purpose, and well-being at the heart of that social construct and that economic paradigm. And not only does that will working with and through nature make our lives and our work better, but there are so many multiplier benefits that come from that new balance. Let's just think about health very briefly and cities. By 2050, 75% of the world, give or take, are going to be growing up in urban systems. So if we want them to care for nature, to know nature, to even touch a blade of grass, we've got to rethink the place of nature in the built environment, in our cities, and to work with the joys of green and blue infrastructure to make our cities and our towns into living and livable places. And that goes into the heart of social equity and fair life chances. Because right now, the people who live in cities, who live furthest from those blades of grass, from those safe open spaces to play and come together, are of course the poor and the marginalized. So that's a call to action for real estate, for investors to shift that pattern. So that's more than enough from me. I'm going to pass over to others, but just with that reiteration that we can make the change. And in passing to Craig Bennett, you're going to hear some of the ways that that could happen. Craig, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claire, and it's a real pleasure to be here joining this press conference today. First of all, just an introduction to the Wildlife Trusts. We're one of the UK's largest nature organisations. We were founded over 110 years ago, and we're a federation of 46 locally run wildlife trusts across the UK. Collectively, we have a combined membership of over 900,000 people, and we actually have more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants in the UK. In fact, 1,000 more. And we estimate that 60% of the British population live within 3 miles of one of our reserves. We were also one of the founding members of IUCN, one of the 5 founding members of IUCN in the 1950s. And we have over 500,000 school children come through our education programs every year. But what we really focus on is that connection between people and nature, and particularly the role of local communities and the role that they can play in helping move to a more nature-positive world. Now, I want to focus on a couple of points here and talk a little bit more about the need to join up the climate and nature narratives. You know, very often people will try and separate these out and put them in different kind of silos. But the truth is really clear. You know, there's no hope of solving the climate crisis unless we can solve the nature crisis and put nature into recovery and move to a nature-positive way of living. There's no hope of solving the nature crisis unless we can tackle climate change. You know, just to remember how these two issues are inextricably linked, we just need to remember the thing that we often forget is that climate change is being caused by burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are themselves essentially dead biodiversity. And we forget that very often. And they are inextricably linked. We cannot solve one without the other. Now, in the climate negotiations that have happened over many years, finally we focused on that target of trying to hold global temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And although that doesn't tell the whole climate story, nothing like, it has become something for companies, for governments, for NGOs to focus on and ask, where are the clear plans that we need to try and make sure we hold temperature rises to not more than 1.5 degrees. And you'll be familiar, there's a lot more to be done there. We're nowhere near where we need to be on tackling the climate crisis. But at least that focus has enabled us to start thinking about the measures needed to tackle it. In contrast, on nature, we haven't seen even that amount of progress. You know, for years, of course, we've had the HE targets, which have all been missed. And we absolutely need that focus that governments and all non-state actors can rally around. And that is the 30 by 30 target. We're hoping that that target to get 30% of our land and sea in recovery, locally and globally, by 2030 can become that rallying cry that enables everyone to focus on trying to achieve that. And it's not everything, nothing like, but it will provide that focus for this story. But of course, not just having the target is enough, never enough. We absolutely need to follow the target up with very clear plans and timetables about how we're going to do this, get 30% of land and sea in recovery. I'm often struck, but when you have events like the World Cup going on in Qatar now, or indeed the Olympics, countries will put together very clear project plans about how to make sure the infrastructure is built in time. And if things get delayed, they will take actions to remedy that and make sure that they can open those stadiums on the day that the event begins. We now need very similar plans in place to rebuild our natural infrastructure by 2030 as well. Very clear project plans at the local, national and international level to make sure we achieve 30% of land and sea in recovery by 2030. And of course, those plans have to be developed in partnership with local communities and indigenous peoples right around the world. And finally, well, what if we don't do this? As Claire's been saying, you know, that would be devastating for nature, devastating for our lives, but also devastating for the economy. You know, it's very easy to forget that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, not the other way around. If there's no nature, there'd be no economy. If there's no economy, nature will do fine. But actually, if there's no nature, there's no economy. So we have to see much greater level of political will right around the world to solve this climate crisis and this nature crisis, both hand in hand. And we have to start treating this issue as if our very survival depends on it. Because guess what? It does. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Now I'm going to pass to Tony Juniper, who's going to talk about the value of nature to the economy. Tony.
Thank you, Claire. Good afternoon, everybody. Great pleasure to be able to share a few thoughts this afternoon. I am the chairman of a British government agency called Natural England. We're independent from government, but work very closely with policymakers in providing scientific advice to inform the direction of policy, and also work as a delivery partner to government on the ground, delivering the things that are decided. And we very much look forward to taking forward the consequences of this meeting on the ground in England during the years ahead. I just wanted to make a few remarks this afternoon about the importance of seeing this economic dimension that Craig has touched upon, and to get beyond where we have been for some time, I think, in seeing, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, the decline of nature as the price of progress. A regrettable but inevitable consequence of how we meet people's needs and how we improve prosperity and comfort across the world. And I do think that frame of reference whereby nature has been seen as expendable really has arisen from the misunderstanding of the economic contribution of the natural world to various other elements of our societies and economies. And this is now quite well-trodden science in terms of the quantification and understanding of different ecosystem services, which are absolutely critical in protecting and conserving human well-being into the future. the climate change question Craig just touched upon. There is no way we can achieve a 1.5 degree to 2 degree temperature limit unless we invest in the recovery of the natural world. And indeed, our ability to adapt to inevitable climate changes. Already we can see the consequences of degraded landscapes in exacerbating, for example, the impacts of coastal flooding or the impact of very heavy rainfall. Very often we see the rainfall statistics, but we don't understand that in parallel with that more extreme weather is the extent to which it's being exacerbated by degraded soils, missing wetlands, and cleared forests. Also a huge dimension, of course, in relation to food security. Sometimes nature recovery targets are presented as a choice in the food security space, and yet there is no economic sector which is more dependent on a healthy natural environment than our food system. For healthy soils, stable climate, pollinating insects, sufficient water, natural pest control, all of these are providing multi-billion-dollar services which often are invisible on balance sheets. And then, of course, the contribution to human health and well-being, especially in a world which is still rapidly urbanizing, the contribution to public health arising from access to vibrant, beautiful natural areas is very considerable, especially as the world now grapples with the rise of chronic long-term conditions, including inactivity, conditions linked to inactivity, depression, anxiety, and so forth. Nature can help with all of that. And of course, nature is our ultimate water utility. All of the fresh water on this planet is endlessly recycled by nature, and without that, of course, we cannot have any kind of social or economic stability. Those kinds of contributions, they have been quantified at different times. One of the most impactful studies, I believe, is the one from Robert Costanza and colleagues published in 2014, which estimated that the contribution of all those ecosystem services I mentioned, plus others, is worth about $125 trillion per year in 2011 numbers. Note in that same year that the global GDP was 75 trillion. So we have natural services much bigger than GDP. The only trouble is, of course, that we don't measure them. And we've invented an economic system that sees the liquidation of nature as positive to GDP rather than something we should subtract from it. So some major shifts in how we think about economic development and growth is needed. And I do hope that one of the messages that will come from this meeting is that this agenda for nature recovery, it is not at heart an environmental issue. It is an economic issue, and it is about social well-being. And I do hope that during the coming days that negotiators will be able to work together to be able to find compromise and common cause in coming with a program that matches the challenge at hand. And it is worth remembering that in the past, we haven't prevailed in the targets that previously have been set, including those agreed in Nagoya in 2010, the Aichi targets, none of which were met at the global level. And I do believe one reason for that is the extent to which we failed to see that this is a central economic question. So over the coming days, there will be opportunities to forge a new accord. And one of the things that I find very positive about this meeting is the extent to which there are hundreds of private sector companies and financial organizations here. The penny is dropping not only in governments, but in boardrooms around the world. Companies are now beginning to wrestle with how they can measure the impact of business activities and financial decisions on the natural world, beginning to think through strategies for net positive business. And I do hope that negotiators will feel heartened and emboldened by the fact of there being major economic actors here who are signaling that they are ready to help with implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And that's a great moment to pass over to Elliot Whittington, who's going to talk about how economic actors need to change their approach to nature. Elliot.
Thank you, Claire. And again, as others have said, it's a pleasure to be here. So you've heard, ladies and gentlemen, about the need to move forward, about the importance of economic actors in this conversation, that it is an economic question as well as an environmental one, because the economy is wholly owned within the environment. If I can just make that a bit more granular, so I think we've heard all these kind of fundamental examples about food and water and how these are subject to change, but it is, I think, from our work at CISL, it's fascinating to see how interconnected that is with different parts of the economy. So, for example, if you think about how where you might have soil degradation, that will have direct impacts on agricultural companies and on the commodity companies, and that will in turn have impact on the banks and financial institutions that invest in them. If you think about water curtailment, that will directly affect the people who rely on that water. It will also affect the industry and change industrial production. These things, so there are both the very serious direct implications of these natural systems shifting and being damaged and the way that we as people rely on them. But beyond the direct implications, there are also indirect implications, which show that this is a systemic economic issue. And I think that identity means that we have to treat it in that way. So you've heard of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which has been a core initiative set up by the G20 to see the systemic risk, the systemic financial risk that are posed by climate change. And now there is a task force on nature-related financial disclosure. CISL, we've done a lot of work on this topic and started to establish how the systemic nature of nature-related risk and how it is fundamental to the economy, and it's going to be fundamentally shaping our economic future in the immediate term as well. There is a very real business case that these problems have to be addressed. There is some examples within the business and financial community. It is early days still, but there are examples of leadership response in it, of businesses and financial institutions taking action to measure their impact on nature and to develop innovative responses, whether it's water companies collaborating with water users in agriculture and landowners to look at how to take a catchment level area response, whether it's food producers using innovative technologies to improve the yield and reduce the environmental footprint of their production, or whether it's actually companies working to provide innovative ways to engage with diet and consumption choices. There are examples. These examples, let me not oversell them, they are currently good examples, but isolated and insufficient. They are not up to the scale of the nature and biodiversity crisis that we currently face. And that's the challenge. As we look about this agenda as being one where we need to think about rapidly and urgently scaling up action, and rapidly and urgently scaling up not just the implementation of what government does, but also changes in behavior from business, from financial institutions, there is a clear need for much more to happen. Obviously, we're here as part of the negotiations for a new global biodiversity framework, and that framework can deliver a number of things that can accelerate the process of that mainstream, accelerate the process of that change. It can give us, Craig has talked about the value of creating space for nature, of the 30 by 30 target, and the signal that creates to economic actors that nature has a kind of core and fundamental value. That's really important. But also important are some of the other parts of the framework, such as the accountability that comes from mandatory disclosure that's in Target 15. So really, really important that is advanced, but also shifting the financial incentives. So things like removing the subsidies for environmentally damaging subsidies and ensuring that you actually have fiscal incentives that advance sustainable behavior rather than unsustainable behavior. Wherever we end up with these current negotiations, so these negotiations have the potential to really move us forward and support action on these agenda. But wherever we end up, make no mistake that governments around the world, banks, businesses, financial institutions will need to change their approaches. So one of our key messages here is not that it is very much in support of what can be negotiated and should be negotiated in this space, but also that the conversation does not stop here, it starts here. And to say that we absolutely need stronger government action, clearer frameworks and policies. We need more business leadership and more granular and at scale business change. And we need a deeper recognition within financial institutions of the risks posed by, the unmanaged risks posed by nature degradation, but also the opportunities that can come with things like nature-based solutions and how they could be scaled up. So for us, this agenda has to be, this is the start of a big piece of work that we look to collaborate with and work with others to really, really drive forward in the future.
Thank you, Elliot. And now the conversation definitely doesn't stop with us. It starts with you. So we've got a few minutes to take questions. There's a microphone there and at the sides. If you've got a question for a specific speaker, please say the name or point at them. We won't think you're being rude. Otherwise, if you address it to the whole panel, I will make an arbitrary choice. So I see a lady over there already primed. Please go ahead and please say your name and where you're from.
My name is Beatrice Olivastri, and I'm from Friends of the Earth in Canada. And I see two of my old, long-standing friends on the panel. I'm disturbed to a certain extent by the prominence placed on recovery without mentioning the damage must stop. And I think it may be useful to ask either Craig or Tony to talk about a stronger role in government around stopping the damage, which sometimes I would suggest is enforcement of regulations, for example. And in the context of these negotiations, specific targets like Target 7 that would have a reduction of pesticides by, I don't know where it's at right now, started at 66%, but very specific targets to which accountability can be attached. So, I mean, I'm very impressed with where the work is going on recovery. I think nature-based solutions is in danger of being all about recovery and not about stopping the damage. And I'd like your comments on how do we start there and what can we do at this meeting to put that in place?
Thank you, Beatrice. I'm going to pass straight to Craig, particularly because he's so rooted at the local level.
Yeah, thank you very much, and nice to see you, Beatrix. You're absolutely right, of course. We, of course, have to stop the damage of existing nature. It is crazy the extent to which we are still seeing the erosion of nature right around the world, and we have to stop and turn it around. And so I think it is very useful to have a narrative that's about being nature positive, to be clear that this is not just about slowing the decline of nature, but reversing it. But of course, you are 100% right to say we've got to stop the appalling damage that's still being caused to nature around the world, and the role that governments and corporations are still engaged in doing that, and the impact that has on local communities. You also mentioned issues like pesticides, and we often focus around space for nature and protected sites, and that's very important. But actually, we have to restore the abundance of nature. Nature doesn't work unless you have species in proper natural abundance. And perhaps one of the best things we could do for that is to dramatically reduce the use of pesticides. And actually, Wildlife Trust Wales has the youth movement in Wildlife Trust Wales in the UK agreed a manifesto for this COP to go to the Welsh government, calling for a target in Wales to reduce pesticide use by 2/3 by 2030. And I think that shows just the kind of feeling of young people, yes, in Wales, but I think echoed around the world, about the need for governments to move far faster in tackling the nature crisis, both by protecting sites and removing chemicals that are designed to kill biodiversity.
Thank you, Craig. Tony, do you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, just add a couple of thoughts, Claire. Very good question, Beatrice, and nice to see you again. The shift in the narrative around nature, it's been quite striking how it's occurred over recent times in this move from talking more about conservation and now to talk more about nature recovery. And I do think this is very important. For me, it's implicit that conservation is kind of the bedrock of nature recovery. We can't recover if we don't hang on to what's left. But if you look at the situation in England as an example, we've got something like 4,000 protected areas, most of them tiny, fragmented, and basically it is insufficient either to conserve what remains because they're so small and they're so isolated from one another, but also is a reflection of how we don't have enough nature left to do all the things that we need to do, to catch carbon, to purify water, to support public health and well-being. So moving into this space where we're explicitly talking about not just hanging on to what's left, but getting into recovery. I think for me, this is really quite an important shift of mindset, because it is about, as Craig said, about bringing back the abundance, reconnecting areas that are fragmented, trying to restore the fortunes of disappearing animals and plants by creating more space for them. So I'm quite excited about the way that it has changed. And in the UK, we have some pretty good targets on this from government, including the goal of having 500,000 hectares of new habitat being created over the coming years. At Natural England, the core of our work is around this idea of a nature recovery network. So using the existing protected areas, but making them bigger, linking them together, getting them into better shape, and in the process delivering a wide range of benefits for society. And actually that nature recovery network, we've built a partnership of different actors to deliver that with us, recognizing that even as a quite substantial and pretty big government agency, we cannot do that on our own. And in that partnership, we have 600 organizations, including the likes of Craig's organization, but also crucially, a number of private sector companies who are in common cause with us. But that reframing, to give people a sense of moving on a journey towards positivity rather than hanging on to what we've got, I do believe it is really quite an important psychological way of shifting the discussion.
I want to hold on to that word excitement, because I do believe we have a duty of hope in these spaces and we can act. So it's a kind of affirmative action for nature that we're really hearing. There's a lady at the back on the left there.
Hi, my name is Celia. I'm a journalist from Barcelona, from Spain. Four short questions. What do you think of bio-offsets as a way for companies to somehow benefit the environment because they've destroyed something else? When you talk about mandatory and accountability, how can we make these targets mandatory? I believe there's a coalition called Business for Nature who are demanding or asking for that. How do we do that? Regarding subsidies, which subsidies should be eliminated? And finally, when we talk about 30-30 target, what are we going to protect under this 30-30? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pass the first three questions at least to Elliot, and then, yeah.
Great, thank you. Very good questions. The bio-offsetting, I mean, offsetting is challenging, and there is obviously this concept of biodiversity net gain that's out there, which is like, can it be understood to be a benefit if a business or an institution is overall adding to the level of biodiversity? Does that make up for the fact that there is a level of destruction? My take is that there are obviously reasons why people invent those kind of frameworks, because we need to do more and it can help facilitate the role of doing more. But it's the fundamentally local nature of ecosystems and the interconnectedness of ecosystems means that you have to be very, very careful about those kind of approaches, because I don't think you can just take in one place and add in another place and that be appropriate. So I think there are some interesting questions, but I think there is some skepticism about that from my side. We are very supportive of and part of the Business for Nature campaign, so we absolutely support Make It Mandatory. I think, from a business perspective, the businesses that we've worked with and many organisations as part of the Business for Nature campaign, we have heard that, where there are leading businesses, they are absolutely clear on the value of transparency, accountability, and a common set of rules and systems and standards that they can operate within. Most businesses want to be able to do the right thing, and they want to be able to do that and carry out their activities. Good, clear rules that are common and consistent and sensibly implemented are a positive for them, not necessarily a problem. There is clearly a huge question about how we implement something like the Make It Mandatory thing, and there will have to be nationally appropriate ways of doing that. But obviously what will be really, really useful is that if we can make that a good, clear global system. And that's going to have to be, hopefully what we can have here is the agreement of the principle, and then we can build off of that, but with very clear standards about how that implementation can happen. Similarly, on the subsidies thing, one would hope that we will get kind of clear language around the scale and maybe even numerical targets around subsidy reduction. But that is going to start a conversation. It's not going to finish it. It's not something where we can have, in this very highly complicated multi-stakeholder negotiation, a detailed action plan is not going to arise from this. We're going to win the principle of it, and hopefully some big numerical targets that will move us forward. But I think there is a lot of expertise out there in the world identifying some of the kind of key areas that need to move. Needs to be done as part of a managed transition. These subsidies exist for a reason, and they often affect, so we're in a world where cost of living is a huge concern, and we do need to think about the social impact. But at the same time, we can't afford to be spending money damaging the ecosystems which we all rely on.
Thank you, Elliot. Just a quick extra comment on offsets. Now I'll pass to Craig on 30 by 30. At first hand, I'm seeing the benefits of the science-based targets influence on the way in which companies behave. So to the question of offsets, it's in the long term, it is clear, and the signals are now going out, that to rely on offsets as the way to tick off your targets will not qualify for the kind of the kudos of the proper recognition certification under proper science-based targets. And I've seen at first hand a company that is already completely rewriting the way it thinks about its own energy and net zero transition because of the signals being sent out informally through the science-based network. So I think your question is extremely well taken. There's a huge sensitivity, as we all know, about greenwash. ESG, for example, means all things to all men or women. But this is where the science, the evidence is so important, and it goes with what Elliot said about the accountability and the transparency. They must come hand in hand, and I would argue as well that that's also a very important piece for diplomacy. So the intersect of transparency, science, and informed diplomacy is extremely important to raise the level of ambition. Craig, on 30 by 30?
Yeah, on 30 by 30, I just want to sort of say that, of course, it's going to be based on sound science to identify where's the best bits of join up, to have bigger, better, more joined up nature, to connect the precious habitats, to create the new bits of nature that can do that, create more space for nature. But it's got to work at all levels. So it wouldn't work taking just a big clump of 30% of land in one country. It's got to be working at the local level and right through to the national level. And it got to involve all actors. And one of the things I often say to people is that in the UK is that, if you've got a garden to your house in the UK, there's nothing to stop you trying to allow 30%, a third of your garden, left wild for nature, so that you too, as a household, can be part of this international movement to try and get 30% of our land and sea in recovery, 30% of towns and cities, 30% of the wider metropolitan areas, 30% of individual counties or provinces or states, and 30% nationally as well, and in our seas. And then we start to see the kind of join up, and that's going to be critically important. Just to comment also on offsets, if I can, Claire, offsets always have to be absolutely the last resort. We've seen the huge problem in the climate debate of often offsets being done as the easy option rather than stopping burning fossil fuels. And in the same with biodiversity, actually there will be some habitats that cannot be offset categorically. In the UK, we talk about ancient woodland, or here in Canada, maybe old growth forest or coral reefs around the world as well. In just the same way that we wouldn't contemplate putting a road through the Tower of London or through the Pantheon in Rome, or indeed the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. We need to see that some habitats are absolutely precious and cannot be offset. If and when offsets are put in, they have to absolutely deliver genuine additionality, but they should always be as a last resort.
We are up against the tyranny of the clock. Thank you so much for coming in such numbers. I'm sorry, are we allowed a very quick additional comment from Tony?
Just one quick one on the subsidies. And, this has been on the agenda at these kinds of discussions now, to my certain knowledge, for at least 30 years. And in terms of, which subsidies are most harmful to nature and biodiversity, it's really in the realm of fishing and agriculture. And those are the areas where probably we would see the biggest benefits in terms of taking a different approach. One thing that we're doing in England at the moment, that the government is doing, which is very exciting, is to switch the subsidies that used to be paid to farmers in relation to how much land they were managing for agriculture, and to transform those subsidies into payments for public goods. And so a public good is something which is not in the market and would include carbon capture, nature recovery, clean rivers, beautiful landscapes. And so this is an exciting program of policy reform, which is exactly in that space of subsidy shifting. It's work in progress, but hopefully over the coming years, we'll start to see some real impact on the ground. And certainly for the work we're doing at Natural England, which is very much in pursuit of the kind of goals which are being discussed and agreed here, that policy tool, that shift of agricultural policy to support land managers and farmers to be recovering nature, probably is the single biggest tool that we've got in the box to make a difference.
Thank you, Tony, and sorry to have jumped in too soon.
That's right.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. We're very happy to continue the conversation in all kinds of ways, and we hope that you found this useful and interesting. Thank you, too, to my fellow speakers. Have a great day.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you.